Hello. In this tutorial, we are going to try to recreate fairly realistic fire based simply on After Effects filters. This will serve as an introduction to the use of filters and the most common elements around amongst all these filters that we have available to us. So let's get to it. The first thing I'm going to do is create a composition, and I will give it a name of main, and this is where I will be creating my fire. Notice that I have a composition of 1280 by 720 square pixels, 30 FPS, 10 seconds. Now, these are the most common settings that I have for anything that I'm teaching during class, but this basically can change with anything depending on the size of your final file. And in any case, these are something that you can change. They have nothing to do with the filter itself. So I'm just going to go and work with this settings. I'll click OK, and there's my new composition window. Into that composition window, I am going to drop in this image that I downloaded from the web. I did a really quick search for hallways with lit with torches, and I found this image online, and I just downloaded it for the purposes of this tutorial. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to recreate this fire but have it moving based on the filters that we have in After Effects. So if you notice when I scrub the video, there's nothing because that's a static image. We're going to try to create the actual filter on top of it. So the first thing I want to do is go back to my main composition, and I will create a solid. This solid I will make the size of the composition, so I'll make sure I click that button, and I can make it whatever color I want, because as soon as I apply the filters that I'm going to be working with, the color of the solid really doesn't make any difference. If you feel more comfortable, you can create a black solid, and then it doesn't really matter because we're not going to be doing any mode to it to remove it. It's going to disappear as soon as we apply the filter to it. So I'll click OK. Actually, I'm going to name that solid. I'm going to call it particles, because that is where I'm going to apply the particle filter. And I'll click OK. There's my solid. And what I'm going to do is under Effects and Presets, right on the right hand side of the window, I am going to, on the search window, I am going to look for Particle World. That is the effect that I'm looking for. You'll notice that it's a 16-bit filter. If I just simply drag it onto the solid, it will create what is called a whirl filter, spitting particles from the center, from a point. Now our task is to remove those particles and make them look like fire. First thing I want to do is, while I'm working on this, I want to turn off the background image. So I'm going to turn off the visibility for a few minutes, and now I'm going to focus on the actual filter. Under Grid and Guides, I am going to turn off the grid because it's just getting on the way. And now I'm going to start focusing on the particles themselves. So I can close this right now, uncollapse it. Let me go ahead and work on the birth rate for this particular. The birth rate refers to the amount of particles that are being produced per second, per frame, I'm sorry. And so you can see that can exponentially grow fairly fast. However, for most particle systems, we want to have enough particles that they create enough of an illusion that you are of whatever material or element you're trying to create, whether it is smoke or fire, in this case water. You need to have enough to produce that effect. However, the higher the birth rate, the more calculations the machine has to do, the CPU, and heavier your project is gonna be at the end of the day, because all of these have to be rendered per frame, and these are stored in RAM. So every time you multiply this, the amount of particles per frame, basically you can end up with gigs of files that are stored within your actual project, and you end up with gigantic projects, things that are also going to memory, and they will eventually become a huge problem, because if you're trying to move files fairly fast, they won't, and rendering time is also affected. So it is good to be careful with the birth rate, the amount of particles that you put into the scene. For now, I'm going to keep it as is. Let me go down to physics. That's the first thing I want to tackle. Under physics, I am going to change the velocity at which this escape from the center. So I'm going to make that 0. so that the particles basically are all growing at from the same point, and they stay fairly close to where they grow from. At the same time, I'm going to change the gravity. And this gravity I'm going to change to a negative value. I don't want the fire going down, I want the fire going up. So I want to make sure that I have a number. And through trial and error, I have discovered that the next numbers work fairly well. So if you notice, I have my particles going up. Now this looks nothing like fire. We're going to change that in just a second. As a matter of fact, let me go ahead and start doing that. I am going to close the physics now, and I'm going to the particle itself, and I'm going to change the particle from type line to something a little bit more textured, like tetrahedron, for example, or I can try polygon. Let me try tetrahedron. I like that one better. Gives more of a sensation of being more of a 3D element. And they still don't look, they look like glass flying out from the center, a little bit closer to fire, but not quite there. So a couple of things we need to change here. We need to change the birth size, the birth size, and the birth size that I've discovered works best for what we're about to do is about 0.35, and the depth size is about 0.1. Those are the values that work best through trial and error, and this is the size of the particle when it's first born, and then this is the size when it's disappearing. I also want a variation of about 100%. I want complete variation, and that is the size of the particles, how they are. They vary from 0.35 to 0.1 on how they're born and how they die. So that gives more random particles as they are being born. And I also want to change the opacity to be about 0.20. Actually, no, let's make it 20%, sorry. And that gives me a bit of transparency around each particle when they're being born. When you have a lot of particles next to each other or on top of each other, you'll get a fairly full color. When they are separated from each other, you see semi-transparency, and that's why you want to get into those tongues of flame when they're born. You want to see them sort of see through them when there's not a lot of fire particles next to each other. So that is good for now. Let me go ahead and change these colors. These colors are not really the final colors we're going to use. We want to use very I don't want to say opaque. We want to use flat colors, and that is because these colors we want to eventually have the ability to either colorize them through a filter, or simply by placing them on top of an image, as we are going to do, be able to pick colors from that image to best match the scene and actually give that sensation of the fire being actually part of the image. That be it image or video, whatever it is that you're placing this on top of. So I'm going to keep the colors for now as they are until I reactivate the image. And let's go back and change the longevity. I want these guys to be, well, they're going to be alive for about a second, and that's good. Let's start to look like a flame. Not quite there. You still see the triangles, but we're not completely done with this. What I want to do now is I want to change the position of the flame. I want to put it where it goes in the image. So let me reactivate the image, and I want this first flame to go on the right hand side, right on top of this little torch, or whatever we want to call that. So let me go to the producer and change the position of the flame. I am going to bring it out to the right hand side. Now these values for position and radius are not percentages. These are per size of the screen. So a value of 1 on the X equals a value of the width on the X of the actual composition. In our case, 1280. Same for position Y. A value of 1 here means the height of the composition. So we need to be very careful on the numbers that we place in there. However, I am going to simply push it out, and I'm going to probably like a little bit further to the right, probably like 5.7, 5.8. Yeah, that's good. And now I'm going to push it into the z-axis to about 0.4, yeah, that's good, around there, 0.45. I'm going to bring it up a little bit on the y-axis. So that seems to be right on top of the other fire. We might want to increase the size of the width of that fire. Let me zoom into that really quick. Use the space bar to get the hand tool, move it, and notice that the fire is on top of the other one, but I'm still going to see some of those flames on the side. So I want to make our fire a little thicker. And for that, I'm going to change the radius on the X and the Z axis. So for the radius X, I discovered that if I enter a value of 0.04, and the same thing for the Z axis, 0.04, that gives me a pretty good width. And I want to now turn off the visibility of the background, and you'll notice that now my particles are just they're too separated from each other. They're not really looking like fire anymore. So that is because I'm not having enough particles into the scene. Notice that I waited this long to increase the amount of particles because this bites into my RAM. So I'm going to go ahead and increase it to about 10, and now I get a good amount of particles going on. Still not looking like fire too much, and we'll take care of that in just a second, but it's looking a little bit better than it did before. Now let's turn off the graphic in the background and let's change the colors of my fire. So for my birth color, I want something that is sort of the brightest point, or something that is flat within the brightest point, and usually I look at the reflections or the projections of the light into the scene to pick those colors. So whatever the light is on the projection would be something like around here or around here in the columns. Let me use the color picker and I'll select, say, that color right there. Perhaps something slightly brighter like this over here. And for the depth color, I'm going to use something that is around the darkest. You'll notice that my fire starts to look a little bit like mud, but that's actually what we want. We want it to be a color that is given a sort of a texture that we can then colorize via other filters if we need to. If our simply working with the filters that we're working at the moment doesn't work, you want to use this, think of it as a mask to take advantage of light and dark values, and those become the values that dictate what the colors are going to be when you apply colors via other filters. So with that done, let me go ahead and apply another filter to that fire. Let me turn off the graphic just for a second and go into my effects and presets window and look for CC vector blur. I want to apply that filter. And this is the one filter that's going to give us a little bit of a plasticky feel to the actual fire. So let me collapse my particle whirl so that I only see the vector blur. Let me increase the amount of blur to about 45. And that gives me more of a fire look to it. But I don't like this little flares that I see around. That's too much of a glow. So I want to reduce that, and I do that by increasing my ridge smoothness to around 4 or 5. That increases my flame, taking over that actual little flares, little hairs that appear to show out of the fire. And now I'm going to increase the smoothness of my map to about, to about, let's say, half of this, 7. And now I get more of a flame feel to this when I scrub through the video. Now, it's still not very impressive because it looks like brown fire. It looks like muddy fire. So let me go back to my composition, turn off the graphic. Let me go back to particle whirl really quick, and let me move that that position on the y-axis a little bit. Sorry, I meant to use the y-axis. Not so far down, probably around there, and then a little bit to the right on the x-axis. So 0.58 works well. So with that done, let me go ahead and pre-compose that particles layer. Selecting the layer, I am going to press Ctrl-Shift-C on the keyboard, and I am going to make sure that I move my filters into the new composition. I'll call this particles pre-comp, and I'll click OK. That moves those fire particles into their own composition, but yet I have a clean composition right here. Now let me make 2 copies of that pre-composition, Control D or Apple D, to create copies. The top one I am going to change to a mode of add, so I'll switch my toggle switches and modes, or press F4 on the keyboard. Either press F4 or click at the bottom under toggle switches modes, and I will switch the mode from normal to add, and now we're getting fire. And the bottommost, the particles pre-comp, I am going to change to, I'm going to apply a filter to that one actually. I'm going to select it and I'm going to apply a filter called Fast Blur. You probably have seen this filter in Photoshop. So I'll apply it and I'll increase the Fast Blur to about 150 pixels, and that gives me that glow. Notice that I get a glow around the fire, and I can click repeat edge pixel so that it covers the whole thing. Now we can make use of that Fast Blur to create the sensation of the fire flickering as it grows or as it decreases. So we're going to make use of that particular value to change the glow so that it goes up and down like so, to give that sensation, that natural sensation of the light being projected from the actual fire. So I will place my time marker at the 1 second mark, and I'll create a keyframe for blurriness. Then I am going to my 4 second mark, and I am going to change my blurriness to about 200, let's say. And actually, you know what? I'm going to change it to 100. I'm going to decrease it. And let me go ahead and select that layer on the timeline, on the composition window, and I'm going to press the U key on the keyboard to reveal the keyframes. Now with those 2 keyframes selected, I'm going to drag a selection across both of them. I am going to my Wiggler window, and I am going to create some kind of flickering by changing my noise type to jagged. I want to change about 5 times per second, and I want to give it a magnitude of about 20, let's say, and I'll hit apply. I'm going to do a quick scrub and see if I'm getting that flickering. I'm honestly not getting enough flickering change, so I'm going to undo that, and with the two keyframes still selected, I'm going to make this magnitude a lot more significant. I'm going to make it about 50. I want to go a little higher perhaps, just to try. I'm going to go 80 and click apply. Let me scrub the video, and now we're getting the change in flickering. So that's what I was looking for. So 80 seemed to have worked. Now with that done, let me press the B key on my 1 second mark and go to the 4 second mark, snap to that keyframe by pressing Shift while dragging my time marker, and then I'll press N to bring in my end position for my work area. I'll press 0 on the keyboard to create a preview, and you'll notice that fire looks pretty natural. You get a little flickering. It gives you that impression of being part of the actual image. Now that this is complete, what I can do is I can go ahead and select all those 3 pre-compositions, and I can pre-compose those into another composition called flame or flames. Now with that pre-composition set up, what I can do is I can make a copy of that layer, select the flames pre-composition layer, press Apple D or Control D on the keyboard, and make that new layer a 3D layer. So let me go back to switches by pressing F4 on the keyboard, or press the toggle switches modes at the bottom, and then make that layer a 3D layer. Now with that layer made a 3D layer, I can change its position. So I'm going to push it out into the Z-axis all the way to around here, and that happens to be around 1650 pixels, perhaps a little more. Make it about 1700. And what I'm doing is I am trying to size this flame to this flame right here, and that happens to be about 1750. Let's do 1750. That seems like a close enough size. Perhaps 1800. That's good. And now let me change the X position to bring it right on top of the other flame, and move it up on the Y position, and that ends up being around 310. So these are the values that I end up with, and I am eyeballing these values, as you can see. Now with that 3D layer in place, what I want to do is switch my tool to the pen tool, and I'm going to use this column right here as guide to start drawing a mask for that particular layer. Close the mask, and now you'll see that the column covers part of my flame. Let's change my tool back to the selection tool, click off the layer, and actually select the composition window, and go to this drop down, which in this case is a drop up, and click fit so that the whole thing fits into my screen. Hit the 0 key on my numeric pad, and now you'll see that the two pieces are part of the composition, and the fire looks fairly realistic. So as you can see, most filters have several things in common. They have values that we update via either keyframes or by dialing in those values depending on how they're presented to us. Some of them are presented to us in revolutions and degrees. Some others are presented to us as values that we enter. And we have control of those through time via keyframes. Those keyframes react the same way as any other keyframes. So you simply create new keyframes and change the values, and they will be changing over time, as you guys can see with the glow in this particular piece. There are other ways that we could enhance this composition. Right now we could make that image a 3D layer, and we could put some kind of light spotlights behind us so that we could actually flicker a lot more. But I'll leave that for class when we're going to detail into the 3D worlds. Hopefully this is something that will help you introduce you to the world of filters and give you something to play with for your projects.